Well, hello guys, this is Kitty with Vintage and Vinyl, back with another great video for you today. And we are continuing our book reading of House of Flesh by Bruno Fisher. And this book is getting pretty saucy, let me just tell you folks. It is amazing what has been developing in this book. Our main character, Harry, is now suspect for murder. So, oh boy, we need to figure out what's happening with that. And where did Layla Doan go? Did she get murdered, or was she just disappearing on us? We don't know what happened with Layla Doan. And I really don't think that Harry is the one that murdered Dr. Doan, Layla's husband. I really think that he's innocent in this whole matter, and he got kind of mixed up with the wrong people and was in the wrong place at the wrong time. But we have to find all of that out today, so we need to know what's going on with that. I see Bob is joining us in the chat. Welcome, Bob. Thank you so much for tuning in. We have Jennifer Miller here. Welcome, Jennifer. We got Helen Booty, New England Thrifter. Thank you so much, Helen. Proud American, Delbert is tuning in. Thank you so much, Delbert. Tim, Tia Fane, welcome, welcome. Jose is here, and I'm so glad you're tuning in. Yeah, Layla is, I think, a bit of a psycho. We've kind of determined that. I think she's a little bit strange. So that's something we got to find out. Louis says hello to all of you guys. It is sprinkler time, so hopefully she does not bark throughout this broadcast, but no guarantees there. But she's just very invested in the story and loves all of you guys. So yes, glad that you never took Louis to Dr. Doan. Me too, Bob, and you didn't take Vlada there, so that's a good thing. We've steered clear of Dr. Doan. He's weird too. You know, he's not totally innocent in this whole matter either. Something is really bizarre with him, so we got to figure that out. Now, if you're not following along with this series and you're new to this book reading, you can always go back and catch the replays on all of the ones to get caught up on the chapters. We are now in chapter 21, so we are nearing, folks, the end of the book, which is amazing. We've gone through this, so it's been really, really fun to see what's been happening. This book has not disappointed. I have to say, this has been a fun book. So we're in chapter 21. There is 27 chapters in this book. So as you can see here, we're almost to the end of this book, and then we'll start a new book. It's kind of a fun little book club we have going on here. And what I love about this as well is it's kind of a look into what was in some of these 50s romance novels, because a lot of times we think of the 50s as being very conservative, and you'd be surprised when you read some of these books, especially this one where our main character Harry is sleeping around with a married woman. So that's pretty shocking stuff for the 50s. Of course, there was a lot going on in the 50s, private parties and things that if you do some research into the 50s, you will find that they weren't so tame as we like to think of the 50s with our poodle skirts and doo-wop music and sock hops and so forth. Hey, Sharon, thanks so much for joining. Also, what's interesting is this is a gold medal book, and I've talked about the history of gold medal before in Fawcett Publications, but they really did change the publishing industry forever. They made paperback books accessible to a whole bunch of people. They weren't really accessible before. In the 40s, you had pocket books for soldiers. So those pocket books were small. They could be carried around during the war, and they were paperback. But for the masses, most books were hardcover, and that was very, very expensive for people. So not everyone could just own a plethora of books. So Fawcett really did change the publishing industry with these gold medal books, because now they made books that were affordable for the masses, and they were fun to read, because this book, as we've seen, is just so interesting, and there's so many twists and turns. So they really did a great thing, and of course they changed, how publishing was done and how writers got paid, and just a whole fascinating history there on Fawcett. So I like bringing these gold medal books here to the channel so you can learn a little bit about their history as well. Fawcett also invented the rotating magazine racks that we all see and love. I don't know if any of them really are still in use anymore, because when you go into grocery stores, they've got them kind of filed straight up and down, but that was something that was revolutionary at the time and a really great invention by Fawcett. So we are going to continue with this book reading. We are in chapter 21 now, and there is so much happening. I've got to be really careful with this book because, as I mentioned, it's old and it is falling apart. So we have now lost the binding. The pages are coming out. So I've been really, really careful when I handle this book to make sure that I'm keeping it intact. This is 1950 Fawcett Publications by Bruno Fisher, and we are now going to delve into chapter 21 of House of Flesh. District Attorney James Berwick was a restless, energetic man, no older than myself. He had taken office in January, and this was his first case he could get his teeth into. He was seldom still. He bounced around even when I was telling my story, and his questions were hurled at me like missiles. He also went into a heavy-handed psychology. He had me sit on a wooden kitchen chair in the middle of the Doane living room, facing Mr. Hickey's painting of Layla Doane above the fireplace. With her image before me, I was supposed to break down and confess. After an hour or so, Berwick began to act as if I were playing the game fair by sticking to my story. Somebody called him from upstairs. He tore up the stairs 2 at a time. A Morse deputy sheriff with a gun on his hip kept me company. I listened to the sound outside of the house. Maxine, excited by the unusual activity, was barking incessantly. I hadn't heard the Doane dogs since shortly after the police had started to arrive. Cars kept coming and going. Berwick charged down the stairs. "Now we have you, Cold Wild. He found blood in the bathroom basin." "Of course," I said. "I washed my hands when I was upstairs looking for Mrs. Doane. You can see what happened to my knuckles. They were bleeding." "Are you sure you didn't wash off his blood?" "Some of it may have been his." My voice was hoarse with fatigue. "I hit a number of him, 2 or more times. His nose started bleeding. I think his mouth bled too." "And his head?" Berwick snapped. "The coroner tells me those head wounds of his bled plenty and spurted. Blood must have gotten all over you." "Sure, and missed my clothes and hit only my hands." He scowled at me. He didn't approve of that answer or any other I had given him. He bounced to the screen door and looked out. "What about Mrs. Doane?" I asked. "I'm waiting for you to tell me." "What about her?" "Are you looking for her body?" "We've looked for everything. Sergeant Hickey and some of his men are going through the area with the Doane dogs on leashes. Maybe the dogs will find her." I nodded. "That big shepherd was especially devoted to her. He'll find her even if Doane buried her in her deep." Berwick squirmed his shoulders as if something were itching him, and he dashed through the screen door. A few minutes later, another deputy came in. He and the one who was guarding me took me outside. A blanket was spread over Doane's body. Berwick and a state policeman with a gold badge stood nearby talking. At the moment, nobody else was in sight. The deputies herded me into a car and drove me to the jail in Fort Able. There were 4 cells in the basement of the red brick county building. I became the only occupant. The furnishings consisted of a cot and a chair from which paint was peeling and a bucket. Close to the ceiling, there was a narrow barred window, only a couple of feet above the outside ground level. After a while, the Morse deputy returned with a tray of watery soup, undercooked spaghetti, and overboiled coffee. But it was food, and I surprised myself by being hungry. And when I first stretched out on the cot, I managed to sleep. Toward the evening, the deputy awoke me. He led me up 2 flights of stairs to the district attorney's office. Berwick sat behind his desk. Almost affably, he waved me to an unupholstered and quite comfortable chair. A skinny, middle-aged woman sat at a smaller desk, and a shorthand notebook opened and a pencil sharpened. The deputy stood with his shoulders against the door. I said, "Did you find her?" "Not yet." Berwick himself didn't bounce, and he bounced a pencil on the desk blotter. "We went over every inch of the house, and the barn, and the ground. She's not buried there." Then Doane played it safer this time. He took her body away in his station wagon and buried it far from his place. "Possibly. Now, tell me exactly what took place. All of it this time." So I went over it once more with the stenographer and wrote down every record. When I finished, Berwick complained. "You haven't changed the story." "The truth doesn't change," I said. He sat back and smiled. "I found out a thing or two about you, Wild. You're a big man in sports. You're an excellent reputation, a fine war record. People who know you speak highly of you. As for your affair with Mrs. Doane," he shrugged, "could have happened to anyone. I saw her in person, and I saw that painting of her in her home, and I understand how a man can lose her head over her." His technique had changed. He was using soft soap. "You were aware of the evidence that pointed to the fact that Doane had murdered his first wife," he went on. "Indeed. We're grateful for you for your assistance there. I regret, however, that we wouldn't have been able to pin it on him, except in the unlikely event that additional evidence was discovered." I said, "By the way, did you ever learn if he and Alice had been divorced in Florida?" "There was no such divorce. It's quite certain that Alice never left Norset. Let me resume. You were in a position to believe that he had murdered his first wife. When you returned this morning and found his second wife had disappeared, you were justified in assuming that he had done the same to her. You had a fight with him, and up until that point, I'm inclined to think that you're telling the truth." I found myself shifting to the edge of the chair. "Doane was bigger and stronger than you," he said. "He was getting the best of the fight." "No, I was faster and in better condition and had more of a punch. I knocked him out." Berwick shook his head. "I'm doing this for your sake, Wild. He knocked you down. You were afraid you wouldn't kill you. A crowbar was on the ground. You rose with it in your hands. You struck him. It may very well be called self-defense." The smile became insidious. "Isn't that the way it happened, Wild?" "No, I gave you the facts a half a dozen times. He was alive when I left." Berwick clucked his tongue disapprovingly. "What alternative are you leaving by us your denial? You either murdered Doane in self-defense, or you cold-bloodedly and deliberately murdered both Doane and her husband." I gawked at him. "Exactly," he said, bouncing the pencil. "2 murders. Last night, Mrs. Doane refused to leave her husband for you. You murdered her and drove off with her body and disposed of it somewhere." "I said that's what Doane must have done." "You said." "You told me a pack of lies. What do they get you? They convinced me that last night you murdered Mrs. Doane, and this morning you murdered her husband. You thought it would be easy to pin the murder on him after he was dead because he was already a suspect of a 2-year-old murder." "Wouldn't he ever stop bouncing that yellow pencil?" Berwick sighed. "Trying to be too smart in a murder is fatal. It becomes far too complicated." I tore my eyes from the pencil, and I sank back in the chair and fumbled cigarettes out of my pocket. There were only 2 left. "So, there are all alternatives," he said. "We can't forget about who murdered Mrs. Doane, he or you. You murdered Kenneth Doane, and that's enough to burn you, unless you did it in self-defense." He couldn't have had much if he was willing to settle on a self-defense plea, or maybe he considered that it would be an opening wedge to get me to change my story and keep talking and make mistakes until he had enough for a first-degree murder. I said, "Your tricks might work with the guilty person, but they can't work with me." He bounced up to his feet. "I don't need tricks. Your fingerprints are on the crowbar. What do you say to that?" "I say you're lying because I never touched the crowbar." Berwick seemed to falter. His eyes lost confidence, and he walked around the desk and jammed his fist into his pockets and snapped at the deputy. "All right, Ted." I was taken back to the cell. The meal that evening was no improvement for the first. I must have regained my taste for food because this time I more or less ignored it, except for the coffee. Then I took off my shoes and stretched out on the cot with the blanket under me. The mattress was lumpy and so far had no bugs. Daylight seeping in through the high barred window was fading. There was a naked overhead bulb, but the switch was outside. Anyway, I had no reason to want light. Now and then I would remind myself that I should think about what happened this morning, that somewhere there was something only I knew that could save me, but I couldn't keep my mind on it. My thoughts stopped and lingered on memories more vivid and real than murder or this cell. The second time I had laid eyes on Layla, I thought Maxine had come out on the porch. Uncommunicative, I almost hostile, and yet all of it starting at that moment, leading to those kisses days later in the kitchen, and then on a Sunday night, her coming to my bungalow and saying, "Undress me, but slowly, very slowly." And that had been the real beginning, because after that, intense and sometimes furious lovemaking, there had been no choice and no will but to go on and on. As I lay in darkness in the prison cell, it seemed to me that last Wednesday night had been symbolic of it all, when I had groped through the dark house as a fog of fear and desire to find her at least waiting for me, soundless and unexpected, in a pink transparent nightgown. And last night, could it have been the only last night? I had lain in bed pretending to sleep while I watched her remove her clothes by the fire, and we had not known that doom had caught up with us, and it was waiting outside in the person of her husband. But I had known an hour later and had gone after them and had spied on her dancing for her in a black veil like death, and eventually I had let her talk me into leaving her alone with the killer. It was no good telling myself that I had done all I could. I had fumbled and blundered. Somewhere I should have forced her to go away with me, and then there, and only that scant wrapper if need be. What if it had gone after us with a rifle? I would have been with her shotgun. I might have killed him then, as nobody else did later. But I would have been no worse off than I was now, and she would still be alive. Or he might have killed us both, and I would have been no worse off. The overhead bulb went on. A key turned in the door, and I sat up. Conrad Hickey, carrying a small lighter and a bag in one hand and a carton of cigarettes on the other, stepped into the cell. The door banged shut behind him. His pleasant pixie face bore its usual cheerful expression. "Here are cigarettes. Jessica packed a bag with your shaving things and a change of clothes. I left it with the desk sergeant." "I'm especially grateful for the cigarettes." I started to open a carton. "You must expect me to be quite here a while," I said wryly. "Oh, no, not at all. We'll have you out shortly. Meanwhile, you might as well keep yourself occupied. Jessica also packed in your bag a double acrostic book." I wasn't a genius. I couldn't get anywhere with a double acrostic without my 1-volume Columbia Encyclopedia and a dictionary and an atlas. But I didn't tell him that. All I would care to do here was to be on my back and smoke a cigarette. Mr. Hickey sat on a chair and accepted a cigarette, and we lit up. Then I said, "Has she been found yet?" I doubt if anyone will find her, at least not for some time. Bill tells me that last week. Doane saw him and others looking for more of Alice's skeleton. Bill gave him a cock and bull story about a lost child, but it's likely that Doane suspected. He would have been more careful this time. Duly, I nodded. Must be a good theory because everyone was reaching it. I lay back on the cot and blew smoke to the ceiling. "So far, absolutely nothing has developed," he said. "No clues of any kind." "What about fingerprints on the crowbar?" "Impossible. That rough iron couldn't take impression." "Berwick told me fingerprints were found on it." Mr. Hickey leaned forward anxiously. "Did you fall for it?" "No, I had inside knowledge. I knew I'd never touch the crowbar." Holding the cigarette pinched between my fingers, he looked around. "There's no ashtrays," I said, "and I'll have to complain about the surface." He dropped the butt on the concrete floor and stepped on it. "I'm glad you see to keep up your spirit, Harry. You needn't worry. There's only a tenuous existential case against you. A lawyer with 3 times the experience of our bright district attorney. I assure you that he hasn't enough for indictment." "Well, then what am I doing here?" "Jim Berwick is hoping for some kind of a break." Mr. Hickey scratched the corner of his mouth with his little finger. I would have been here a good deal sooner, but, there were ethical considerations. After all, my son Bill was one of the investigating officers. I could hardly defend a man whom it was sworn duty to prove guilty. People would talk, and it wouldn't look right to his superiors. Bill and I discussed it, and he agreed to be removed from the case on the ground because he's your friend. His request was granted, and here I am with my legal talent, such as it is, at your disposal. I said, I don't want it. What? Are you saying you don't want me to be your lawyer? That's right. Mr. Hickey rose and took 3 steps to a wall and turned and stopped at the foot of the cot. Harry, did you do it? Will you believe me if I denied it? He thought it over. Frankly, I don't know, but I defend you anyway. I never known a case with more extenuating circumstances. You naturally had the reason to fear him as a killer after having found those bones. When you fought with him, you were justifiably afraid that he'd murder you. You didn't intend at him that hard with the crowbar. You were terrified. At worst, you had a mental lapse. No thanks. I've only one defense. I didn't do it. He resumed his seat. Under the naked bulb, his face looked strangely bloodless. You see the problem, Harry, if Doan had murdered his wife, who you had killed him in reprisal. His death was reprisal for which wife, I said. For Layla's murder or for Alice's murder? Alice, he muttered, and looked up at the dark window. I see. You don't trust me. No. I closed my eyes against the glare of the overhead light. Presently, Mr. Hickey said, Possibly, it wasn't Doan who murdered Layla. I tossed my cigarette to the floor and let it smolder there. You want to be my lawyer, but now you think I killed both of them. My boy, I don't for a moment. He looked shocked. Is that what happened? No, but what's the use of denying? I can give you more theories, but what's wrong with them is that they leave me out of it. It won't help if you're bitter. Why should I be bitter? Everything's just so wonderful. He strode about the cell some more. Then he asked, What are your theories? There's one you won't care for. That Doan was murdered because somebody very much didn't approve of what he had done to Alice. Another is that Doan killed Layla, and neither did I. Somebody else did. I stopped. Mr. Hickey finished it for me. Because another man was in love with Layla Doan. Perhaps, like you, he was her lover. And while he could take a husband, he couldn't take a competing lover and killed her in jealousy. Yeah, something like that. Well, then who killed Doan? The same person, because Doan knew whose Layla killers was. Mr. Hickey sighed. You can't keep widening your circles within circles until they take in practically everybody. That's right, practically everybody. He went to the door and watched me from there. Harry, what can I do to make you take me into your confidence? You're in my confidence already. You and the whole world. I suppose it's all about the newspapers. You're a prominent figure, you know. Reporters have come here as far as New York. I wonder if they'll put me in the sports page. I'm glad to hear you joke. Standing there against the door, he seemed to have withered physically. Circles, including almost everyone, he murmured. Circles, including almost everybody. Is that why you don't trust me? Yes, especially as I keep wondering why you're so anxious to drive me into Layla Doan's arms. Harry, that's a ridiculous notion. All right, everything's ridiculous. Love and death and me being here. Oh, yeah, so ridiculous. I lay back and closed my eyes. I heard him rap the door, and I heard the deputy let him out. He said, Good night, my boy, and I muttered, Good night. The door closed, and the light went out, and in the darkness, I fumbled for a cigarette. Well, guys, that is it for chapter 21. That is quite a chapter. So our main character, Harry, is now arrested and suspected of murder. But what is going to go on in the future, I don't know. I don't think that he did it. I'm kind of thinking now that Layla Doan is actually still alive and she murdered his first wife and murdered him. That's my theory. Layla is sketchy and she deserves to be found. I think she's fled. I think she's just completely fled and is trying to reinvent her identity. Who knows? Yeah, 2 wives in 2 years, though, that's a bit sketchy too, Tia Fane. I agree. Your brother's driving like a maniac. Well, tell him to be careful, Angela. I've seen them in used bookstores. Oh, you have, Bob? Are you talking about House of Flesh and Gold Medal books? Let's see. Sharon is here. Welcome, Sharon. So, yes, this is definitely very, very interesting. Hey, Jeannie. Welcome, Norma Jean Plus One. Thank you so much for being here. I think that's all of the comments from during the reading. But yes, this is definitely a very interesting book. So we got to find out what happens next, because the trial probably will come up. And I don't know if they'll ever be able to prove our main character innocent, but I think he's innocent. I think he just got caught up with Layla and was in the wrong place at the wrong time with the wrong people. That's my theory anyway. So that is it for the reading today. Come back next Monday because I'm doing something very, very special. I'm going to be doing a Jell-O recipe live on camera, and that is in honor of Jane over at Doggone Happy Vintage. I donated a Jell-O recipe to Jane's Jane-a-thon, and so people chose what recipe I'm going to do. Well, they'll be choosing what recipe I'm going to do. They paid to have the right to choose. And all of those proceeds went towards Jane, who needs our love and support right now. So we'll be taking a break next Monday from the reading, but I will be live doing a Jell-O recipe. And this is in advance of the 2000 Jell-O recipe. So when I hit 2,000 subscribers, I'll be eating the shrimp Jell-O, which you guys voted for, number 4 live on air. But I will be doing one in advance in support of Jane, since she needs our help right now. And if you're not subscribed to Jane over at Doggone Happy Vintage, go do that. She could use a big boost right now. She's going through some pretty severe medical problems, so we definitely want to support and help her. And I will be doing that Jell-O recipe for you next week live on air. And also this week, we've got some very fun things happening. I will be doing another duo dive with Patrick, the trusty huckster mercantile. That will be on Patrick's channel, and I am going to be interviewed by Patrick on my collection of Tobacciana and Tobacco 10, so stay tuned for that. That's this Wednesday at 9:30 Eastern on the trusty huckster mercantile channel. And then on Sunday, I will be hosting the next episode of Tales from the Triptych, and I will be telling my tale on records and vintage vinyl. So come back for that. That will be a lot of fun. Great new shows. And there's a special video coming out on Wednesday at 7 o'clock on my channel, so stay tuned for that as well. Hey, Daniel, thanks so much for coming, but that is okay. I'm glad you're able to give a thumbs up. Thank you for tuning in. The racks. I've seen gold medal books too, but I have seen the racks. Oh, Bob, that is very, very cool. The Jell-O will have a page of House of Flesh in it. That's right. Hey, Vlad. I just read Bob's comment, and his rat is Vlada. So I was saying hello to Vlada, and then I saw Vintage Viking Treasures, and I was going to call you Vlada, but that's Becky. So Becky, thanks so much for tuning in. I'm glad you are joining in. So those are the things happening for me this week. Make sure you tune in to all the things happening tonight in the vintage community. Johnny G's Vinyl Treasure Show will be having a live 60s edition on his channel. I believe that's 10 p.m. Eastern tonight on Monday, so a great listening experience there. And then also Tim at Over the Years will be having his sale with Josie and Ma Dukes on his sale, his channel Over the Years, and it will be a vintage live sale. So if you want to go shopping with some great glass and great items, 8 p.m. tonight on that channel. I think Vintage Rescue Squad is taking a break, so that's not happening tonight, but George, the Antique Nomad, will be having his premiere, as always, at 8 p.m., so I'll try to catch that. But I'm going to sign off. I'm going to get some dinner. Oh, it's at 8. Okay, so lots of things happening at 8 tonight. So you can bounce around. So thank you so much, Bob, for correcting me on that. 10 o'clock is his show on Saturday evenings, which there was a great show this past Saturday. So if you missed the replay, if you missed it live, you can catch the replay at 10 p.m. Eastern. That was when that video premiered on Johnny G's channel with a great set of vintage vinyl, some great 50s doo-wop. Okay, folks, so I'm off to get some dinner and work on my next video. But I hope, as always, folks, that you will stay in, stay safe, and binge YouTube. And I'll catch you around the tube. Bye, friends.